Good evening. Welcome to our Bible study tonight. It's kind of a little bit of a rainy summer day out there, and but it's nice, and I'm just loving living in East Tennessee and having four seasons. Before we begin tonight, I want to let you know that Ellen Gibson passed away. You'll remember that Carl, her husband, passed away several years ago, and she was forced to move away. But she has remained in our hearts, and she has finally joined Carl in heaven. So you can keep the Gibson family in your prayers right now. Our Bible study tonight is from 1 Samuel chapter 8, and this is where Israel demands a king, and Samuel is not happy about it. It reads this way: When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah, and they were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not follow in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us like other nations. But this thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to govern us. Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, Listen to the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Just as they have done to me from the day I brought them out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so also they are doing to you. Now then, listen to their voice, only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint himself commanders of thousands and commanders of fifties, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest and to make implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, who you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. But the people refused to listen to Samuel. They said, No, but we are determined to have a king over us, so that we may also be like other nations, and that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles. When Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, Listen to their voice, and set a king over them. Samuel then said to the people of Israel, Each of you return home. So the first question is, why would the people demand a king? And the reason is because they were scared. There were armies on both sides of them. And, from time to time, they would come through and they felt helpless because they didn't have a real army. But it's always more complicated than that. And I think the author in Nurturing Faith just does a fabulous job with this particular passage. Because the question you have to ask right off the bat is there something for us to learn now from that story then? We never only look at it as a historical set of facts. There's always something that reaches out through the ages, and that is certainly the case in this story. Well, the author calls it an uncertain demand, and he says only the most extreme anarchists would argue that a country does not need some sort of centralized government, but they usually belong to groups that have recognized leaders. Isn't that funny? I love that. Whether we think of clubs or countries, good leaders are essential for growth and health. We may grow tired of what seems to be a never-ending cycle of campaigns and elections, but we recognize the importance of good leaders, and we celebrate our ability to participate in their selection. He says today's text takes us back to Israel's first foray into kingships. Up until now, the descendants of Abraham would be called judges. The leaders would be called judges. But this is during that period of transition. They wanted to be like other nations because they were scared. What did the people hope to accomplish? How would it turn out? And how can we learn anything from this? Well, these things that the Bible teaches us are timeless issues. They're not just true back then. There's always truth for us now. So he breaks this down into the elders' desire, the elders of Israel and the tribes, the prophet's warning, and then the people's choice. This is what they chose, and they had to live with the consequences. He says the Bible portrays a situation in which the 12 tribes of Israel lived in a covenant arrangement with God. Samuel understood this to mean the Israelites should have no other king than God, whose divine leadership was mediated through what we now know as the judges. Samuel was the last of the judges. He also served as Israel's singular priest, and of course they thought he was a prophet. Though he rarely left the territory where he was, it describes him as being highly respected by all the leaders of all the tribes. But who would lead when Samuel died? Samuel had appointed his sons as judges, but they proved to be what he calls grifters, taking bribes and proving themselves unworthy. In other words, everybody knew it. They knew that Samuel's days were numbered. They knew the kind of men that his sons were, that they were not men of God, and they felt like they had to do something about it. So as Samuel grew old, a group of tribal leaders came to him with an observation and a request. You're old and your sons do not follow in your ways. We're going to need a king like other countries do. He said their request seemed eminently reasonable. The tribes were scattered across a large area, bound by just kind of a loose confederation. There was no central government, no standing army, no system in place to protect the borders. And meanwhile, there were Philistines to the west and Ammonites to the east. So if Israel was going to survive, the elders believed that they would need a strong leader with the authority to conscript an army and do taxes and does everything that you have to do to support that. And so we have to ask this question that seems reasonable to us, but Samuel was saying to them, look at our history. God has always taken care of us. Why would you not continue to do what we have been doing? But reason pointed towards a king, and this really displeased Samuel. He was committed to the idea that Israel should be ruled by God alone, with judges and prophets helping interpret God's will for them. In Samuel's mind, God had proven quite capable of calling out divinely inspired judges in times of national emergency. So the old priest Samuel regarded the elders' request as a personal rejection. He took it personally. They don't believe in me either. So the next set of verses is the prophet's warning. It says, according to the narrator, God recognized that the people had rejected the idea of divine leadership for the earthly model of kingship, but God did not give up on them. As Samuel prayed, God comforted the prophet. They have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. He says, the Israelites had a long history of rebellion, God reminded him, from the days they emerged from Egypt, forsaking God for other gods and going with their own ideas. He says, knowing the elders' determination to choose a different path, God instructed Samuel to listen to their voice and give them a king, but not without giving them a severe warning first. He says Samuel's warning overlooked the positives and emphasized only the negative aspects of having a king. The men would be taken, the sons would be taken, the women would be taken, their slaves would be taken. He says the king's acquisitions would go beyond human capital to include tangible property. He would confiscate the best of everything that you have, your fields, your wine. He says, stretching the specifics for maximum effect, Samuel added a warning that male and female servants, in addition to the best of your cattle and donkeys, would be taken from landowners and put to work serving the king. And then the most severe warning, and you will be his slaves. Can you imagine being told that you're going to be a slave and insisting on making that happen? Having painted such a disheartening picture, Samuel saw no good future. You will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. And then the last section he calls the people's choice. He says, in so many words, Samuel was issuing a good old I told you so ahead of time. And he's warning them that God is going to have no sympathy for them bringing this on themselves. He says, perhaps Samuel hoped they would change their minds, but the elders were not dissuaded. Despite the cost, they were determined to have a king so they'd be like other countries. The Israelites were quite aware that these nations profited from having a centralized government and an inspiring military leader. Samuel could only see the negative side of kingship, but the elders focused on what they saw as positives. Samuel saw Israel's demand for a king as a sinful rejection of God's way, while the people saw it as a realistic need for changing times. So the narrator, writing many years after the people experienced both good and bad kings, remember who the first king was? Saul. He was an absolute disaster for the people. He had a temper. He was paranoid. Just was not a good king at all. But then, of course, it was followed by King David, who was the hero of the Hebrew people. Now, this is where I love how he draws this up until today. He says, when the people rejected plan A, God did not write them off, but remained faithful and proceeded to plan B. God knew that a king who followed God's ways would be good and bless the nation, but a wicked or bad king could pose a grave danger. There was potential for good or bad, as there had been all along. So God chose not to give up on the Israelites again. Like a loving parent who works hard to relate to his or her children on their own level, God was willing to meet the people of Israel where they were and work with them in whatever ways that he could. It says, can modern believers learn from this ancient story? We know that we're all prone to fall short of God's ideal for us. That's an important word. We're prone to trust our way over God's way, yet God does not cast us aside or give up hope that we may yet prove faithful. Well, the big takeaway here is, what is God's will for your life, and does that ever change? And the answer is, it absolutely does change, because we're all flawed. God has a new will for us every day. Certainly it is an ideal, a perfection that we can never choose completely. But it is also a way of trying to get us to understand to get out of our own way and not to have to suffer from the kinds of things that we see over and over and over again. So, the will of God, that's not just one thing. That changes on a daily basis. Why? Because he loves us so much. And it's the same kind of love that a good parent has for a child. Obviously, your hopes and dreams for your child change as they grow older, sometimes making mistakes, sometimes making great accomplishments. But things change as they go along the way. So it's never the same. It's one of the greatest things about being a Christian. You never know what God is going to do next. You just have to be open to it. I hope this message finds you well. I hope you're enjoying living in East Tennessee as much as I am. One of my favorite quotes is from Charlie Daniels. Ain't it great to be alive and live in Tennessee? God bless you. I'll see you on Sunday.